Hello and good evening, and welcome to this month's History Club. It's held in conjunction with the Linen Hall Library and the LGBT History Project of ANI. Our project is a collaboration between Rainbow Project, Cara Friend, and Here ANI, and we're very kindly funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund. Tonight we'll have a real special person in to speak to us. And I'm sure he's going to laugh at me calling him a special person. I've known Jeff myself we were trying to work it out last night. I think it's about from 2014. And I know Jude is very pleased to be doing the conversation. So I'm going to hand you over to Jude. The way we're going to do it, Jude is going to speak to Jeff and ask him some questions, and then we'll have a question and answer session. Can I ask you all to keep yourselves on mute? And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. Thanks. Jude, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mary Ellen, and welcome to everybody this evening. It's a really, really special occasion as we sort of reflect upon and celebrate our LGBT successes. And there's none more prominent at the moment than Jeff Dudgeon and Co.'s victory, which we're celebrating 40 years ago, when after a number of years in the local courts, going all the way up through the courts system, Jeff and others went to the European Court of Human Rights and succeeded in having a judgment for decriminalisation of homosexuality in Northern Ireland. So really, I've been very, very excited about this, and there should be a little bit of a scrolling PowerPoint, which may or may not work, depending on technicalities. But really, I want to sort of share with you some of Jeff's wisdom gathered over a huge number of years as a plaintiff, as an activist, a human rights proponent, and as a historian himself of some repute, and author of a number of historical books. So Jeff, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, just from the start, that just to fill in?
Yeah, thanks very much, Jude, and I'm very pleased to be here speaking to such a big audience, and knowing a number of the people. It's especially exciting to see them and their faces, because we haven't met very often in the last year or two. From my own career is well, it's quite long, which is why I'm not going to go through it every part of it. But essentially, in terms of being gay, I was aware of being gay from an early teens. Had a couple of years fighting with myself, and by mid-teens I had come to terms with the whole fact of being gay. I think it was helped to some degree by reading novels, and there was the most minimal amount of books on the subject. DJ West's Penguin, I think, was the only item you could buy easily. But there were novels like James Baldwin's, and a guy called John Reckie, who wrote a very extreme book for the time, probably still is extreme, called City of Night. But the big problem I saw myself and others in that era faced was we didn't know how to meet other gay people, because we couldn't declare ourselves. We were seriously self-oppressed and seriously frightened, and it was just inconceivable that we would speak to somebody and say, hello, I'm gay. It just wasn't possible. And even if you did, you wouldn't know where, you still wouldn't get no closer to other gay people unless you hit upon someone and you were lucky. Some people were very lucky. Some people were bold and out and about, and risked problems by declaring themselves or going cruising or something, but I didn't until I was about 19 or 20, and then found out about the Royal Avenue Bar in Rosemary Street, which was the only gay venue in the city in the 60s, mid 60s, which is going back a bit, I have to say. And the bar was pretty underpopulated, and the bars closed at 10 p.m. in that era. So, you know, you were going out, and there was no front loading or anything like that. You just arrived. I arrived with my copy of the Belfast Telegraph to hide behind, and a pack of cigarettes, which I'd never smoked before, and didn't stop thereafter, and waited to observe the other 15, 25 people in the bar. So the Royal Avenue Bar wasn't that big. To be honest, wasn't very exciting, and people didn't have flats to go to, and it was all rather furtive. And you just didn't make friends because there was no socializing. You couldn't develop relationships, or I found that was the case. And it wasn't until 3 or 4 or 5 years later when, with the advent of gay liberation and the group at Queen's, which Brian Gilmore was instrumental in putting together, along with Andy Hines and a guy called Martin McQuigg, whom I never met. So things all changed from that moment for me anyway, in I think 73 when I joined up. So does that give you a bit of background there, Jude?
Yeah, that's really helpful. I'm really, really interested in what it was like, you know, going out at the time, because, you know, now we have a selection of, well, you know, we have phones in our pockets with cameras. We memorialize all of the aspects of our lives, from cups of coffee to nights out to new outfits to everything. I kind of want to get a sense what a typical night out was like in the 1970s, because you've obviously got the conflict. There's heightened security risk for everybody in Northern Ireland. So what was like a typical sort of night out for you? And you can edit it as you wish.
Well, as I said, the Royal Avenue was the only venue in the 60s. I have to say, I went to Trinity College in Dublin, and Dublin was a much more exciting city in gay terms. It was, I mean, it was twice the population, and there was more overt gay activity in an odd way, because people just couldn't conceptualize, I think, that homosexuals existed. So you were allowed to get on with your life fairly well. And there's a particular bar called Bartley Dunn's, which was exotic, to say the least. So Belfast in the early 70s, we had the Royal Avenue, and then we had the Gay Liberation Society, which met weekly at Queen's Students' Union, maybe 25, 30 people there, and we were getting involved in campaigning and event. And at some early point, we started running discos at Queen's in the Students' Union, which became very, very popular every other Saturday night, I think. Even with the troubles, because at that point all dancing and nightlife had pretty well died off. So they were great fun, and you know, we would really come of age whenever we could see 300 people dancing to ABBA or Sister Sledge or Sylvester, and we enjoyed ourselves, and we really had a great time in many respects. Now there was, as I said, problems, and there were always the gay problems that people faced of particularly significant violence. If people were caught on or caught or just were thought to be gay, you know, some aggressive drunk could turn on you and would often overdo the violence. And you know, I'm not going to go on dwelling on it, Jude, but I think in my years, I can think of 10 people who were murdered, and many more suffered serious injuries, both gay men and lesbians, because and this is the thing I've said before, I think the thing that people object to isn't homosexuals as such, or it's people who betray their gender in a sense, feminized men or masculinized women as they're seen. They're out and about and maybe more obvious in that respect, but they also got and get to some degree a harsher reaction. So we were enjoying ourselves in those days, and then there was the first gay-owned bar opened up in North Street called the Chariot Rooms, which was owned or put together, run by two guys called Ernie Thompson and Jim Kempson. And that was really popular for a number of years. Never too sure why they closed, but Ernie and Jim were the other side of the coin in some respects. They'd been in jail for being gay in the late 60s, and in a sense were able to, because they had no reputation, probably because they were able to go ahead and run a gay bar. And they ran actually, just come back to me, they ran a gay disco at the Royal Avenue Hotel when it was a hotel on the skids before Queen's, and they were very popular. So Ernie and Jim had a great thing going, a great clientele, and they represented, you might say, the more conservative end of the gay society. I can recall them, they were concerned about our campaigning, their attitude having been through the hell in a sense. They said, look, it's better to keep a low profile, is it not? And we're getting places, we're achieving things, we're becoming more out and about, and so leave it be. And well, we didn't have a fight or anything, but I do recall discussions to that end.
And Jeff, was it just talking to some LGBT activists more recently? Being an activist is challenging at the best of times because you are challenging the status quo, the established order of society, and whatever type of activism you're doing, you're wanting change. Was that a lonely thing for you in the 1970s, or was there a great deal of support, or was there a bit of conflict? I'm sort of thinking of David Norris, who has said that, with each sort of new couple of months, the LGBT pressure groups split over and over again because nobody could really get on. I don't think very much has changed in some respects, but just what was that sort of like? Because you were really at the forefront of that.
Well, I wouldn't say we had our conflicts, internal conflicts. There was, the fairly classic radical versus reformist. Even in the early 70s, there was radical drag. There was a concept of gay liberation being revolutionary, not just asking for change, parliamentary change. And we had conflicts, and there were conflicts between men and women, lesbians and gay men. They could get quite tense at times. So we had all those things, and we also had an internal split, which I won't go into, but prompted the creation of the Northern Ireland Gay Rights Association. And in a sense, Dublin and Belfast, who'd come together with Cara, which it died away in Dublin, and we started Cara Friend then as a separate organization, and we're getting a grant from the Department of Health in the early 1970s. The same government which was persecuting or prosecuting us was also funding us, which was a piece of absurdity in one respect. But we started the Strasbourg events, and so I wasn't alone by any means. There were half a dozen of us who were significantly involved in all the different efforts, and you'll have recalled the newspapers that we put out, or the magazines, Gay Star, Northern Gay, Niagara News. So we were, I have to say, I think we were bigger than our numbers in that respect, and we did have a lot of journalistic connections, and we were on TV in the mid-70s. You know, it's almost frightening to think of how out and bold we were in those times. I think about 4 or 5. We had the BBC ran a spotlight program in '76, which featured about 6 of us, and other supporters and from different parts of the world. But we never got any political support to speak of. When we ran what we call the 74 committee, I think John Hewitt, the poet, and his wife Roberta were the only 2 significant figures who showed up to support us. The 3 journalists I have to thank in particular and gave us a great deal of coverage, and that was Mary Holland, Vanilla O'Connor, who's still about, and Sandra Chapman, who also is still about in the newsletter. So we were very reliant on those journalists to protect us in many ways.
That's really fascinating, especially in the context of, you know, the social media era that we live in. Everybody has an opinion and everybody can publish that opinion. Whereas going back to the 70s and 80s, it was letters to newspapers and the televisions, the traditional media. I really love you've mentioned it before about a meeting of the Gay Liberation Association in the John Hewitt Bar. Other bars are available in the interest of balance, but I think that's really lovely. So some of the places that we can still go into today have a real place in our LGBT history. One of the other things that I thought was really interesting, and just, you know, you talking about the media representation of LGBT rights, of gay rights at the time. One of the things that I found really funny was last year, whenever I was researching your case, the Linnenhall Library kindly, sort of between lockdowns, allowed me in to look at old copies of the Belfast Telegraph newsletter and the Irish News. And I was struck by how balanced some of the coverage actually was. But one of the things that I find very funny is that the different editions of the Belfast Telegraph, so for those of us of a certain age who can remember people shouting "sixth" and "sixth late," I find it very funny because your case wasn't reported in the country editions. So I love the idea that in the early 1980s, LGBT people didn't exist outside of Belfast. And I just sort of wonder, you know, this is a whole history project. So I kind of want to know, are there any other sort of hidden areas of Northern Ireland that had, you know, glimpses of gay life in the 1970s, 80s, 90s?
Well, we were fairly Belfast-centric, no question of that. That was inevitable. But can I see one of the people here today or tonight is Stephen Burkett in Strabane, who ran a solo operation there and eventually linked up with Derry, who developed Car Friend and you know, replicated all the normal things that you'd expect in a city with discos at the university and such. And Coleraine actually was one of the earlier radical wings or places. I think the very first gay meeting was held in Coleraine at the university there. So it was spread around, but essentially Belfast remained the key area. And of course we got premises in University Street. And I think maybe there have been 6 or 7 premises that gay organizations have lived in over the years. Some of them glossier than others, some of them like the Carpenter Club, which is above the disco, which in Long Lane was another place. But as I say, we didn't act alone. And other people, there's some of the people here would be able to tell you how they saw things happening.
And I quite like the idea of you in the Carpenters Club as a bouncer. Lots of people here may not think of Jeff as a bouncer, but if you can tell us about like what was the clientele like at the time, and are there any sort of memorable nights that you can tell us about?
Well, I mean, we all did bouncer to some degree at the university Gay-Lib Society discos, and it could be quite fierce at times. You had to both stop fights or intervene if fights had started. And Belfast was not quite as maybe pacific as it might be today, insofar as bars still operate. Maybe I haven't been out in bars enough to know what life's like there, and we also had to then deal with people who wanted to come into the discos who weren't gay and were nasty or unpleasant. You learn to duck and weave, and I did get punched a few times, two times in particular, by other gay men, which is not very attractive proposition. And similarly down at the Carpenter Club, when we had to deal with sort of city folk. I mean, at Queens we were somewhat insulated from the passers-by, but not down the Carpenter Club. And so there was a whole series of different people did bouncer. There was a guy who's now named, whom we inherited from the chariot rooms. His name escapes me just as I speak, but a rather gentle older man who was always very interesting to talk to alongside him, because he had long sort of Labour Party history in Belfast that must have dated back to the 30s and 40s. So yes, I mean, I'm not a courageous person, certainly not in upfront fighting. I'm maybe more courageous at distant work, like writing things and hiding them. But you had to be fairly butch to get through a disco sometimes.
Well, that's really fascinating. Are there any sort of people who really, really stick out that you've represented a number of people, and a number of the deceased? You mentioned about 10 LGBT people who died. Can you tell us a little bit about any of those cases that particularly resonated with you and particularly struck you as unfair and inhumane?
Well, there were, as I say, a number of cases. We had differing roles. After in the later period, the police would actually would come to us and ask for our assistance in maybe putting flyers around the gay community, or warning people in particular that there were certain areas, particularly in the sort of late night cruising area of the time around Chichester Street and the embankment, the street that runs along the Lagan. And so one of the saddest cases was Anthony McCleave, who had left the chariot rooms, as I recall, and was found dead some hours later outside the fire station. Now, utterly ironically, his own brother, his younger brother, I think, had also been found dead in that area a year or two earlier. And the police were initially of the view that Anthony had met with an accident, and rather foolishly they assumed he was drunk. And when a month later, when the lab reports came back, he had very little alcohol in his system. But basically, he was beaten and his head was pushed against a spike. And it was only at the inquest, which I attended and gave evidence, that it emerged, and I don't know why this was kept back. A fireman had been aware of a fight outside the fire station and heard their voices and shouting, and the police, for some reason, hadn't taken account of that. So eventually we got the right verdict. It took a lot of effort, and then in due course, there was a compensation claim came up in the courts for his sister who was dependent on Anthony, and the judge, did give criminal injuries compensation after a bit of a battle. He deducted 10% on grounds of culpable negligence because, as he put it, Anthony was out coasting. We didn't argue with his phraseology at the time because the money was coming through. And there've been others. There's Barnett's Park, the death there of a young man. And most recently, it was a suicide of a very young boy, actually, after being arrested at the Giant's Ring. And similarly, the most recent cases that I dealt with were in Coleraine, where the police had raided one of the local cottages and put in some form of entrapment process. And despite our efforts, we went as far as the Attorney General in London to try and stop the prosecutions because there was no significant harm done. They went ahead, and one of the guys, I could recall as much as his house windows were smashed and his car was set on fire, and others lost their jobs and their marriages were under great stress in some cases. But I think now the last view we had with the police, and this is some time back, is that they have a graded response to outdoor sexual activity. That they don't go in mob-handed and arrest everyone at the beginning. They will warn people, they will caution people if they persist, and get the gay organizations to help out in that respect. And only if there's a very serious complaint against somebody will they act in terms of courts. Oddly enough, in Dublin, only a few weeks ago, there's reports of an operation in a retail outlet in the city, and half a dozen people, it sounds at least, were brought into the court with in some cases, their names mentioned. So most of you will probably know that, your reputation is pretty important. And at that time anyway, the concept of some sexual misbehavior and the court mentioned was death, social death, if not actual death, because so many people just couldn't face the consequences of a court appearance, or more importantly, a piece in the newspapers about you.
Jeff, you mentioned Dublin there and a number of murders that have happened here. It seems to me, looking back on the history of gay rights in Ireland, that the murder of Declan Flynn in Fairview Park was an incident which really galvanized public opinion and really brought out a whole series of allies who wouldn't necessarily think themselves as LGBT rights activists, but it was the sense of unfairness that murderers could walk out of jail for nothing. I know that you've written on legacy. Why do you think the same thing hasn't happened in Northern Ireland? And are there any ways that we can address this? I'm sort of conscious that you've also worked on the Turing law, and you had that passed through the Assembly, which I believe is the only pro-LGBT law that the Assembly has ever passed. So just there's a few questions in there. Just would welcome your thoughts on that.
Well, the gay pardons or Turing law was, as you mentioned, the only law that the Assembly agreed to. Well, they didn't so much pass it as they voted to allow Westminster to include Northern Ireland in the gay pardons legislation that was going through about 5 years ago. That was an achievement in some respects, but and it was actually due to Arlene Foster and Martin McGuinness at the time agreeing to let Westminster do the needful, and I don't think she was very popular in her own party for allowing it. And Jim Allister tried to tried to get a vote against it in order to embarrass her, I think, more than anything. But he couldn't get a seconder, so there never was a vote in that respect. And I've now forgotten most of the other questions, Chair.
The response to Declan Flynn's murder was that Dublin had there had been a pride parade in the sort of early 70s, but then in the 80s, as a response to the murder of Declan Flynn, there was what we would recognize to be a pride, where we had events and we had a march that took up public space.
Well, we never were able to galvanize public support in that way for a number of reasons. I think we were still we felt too vulnerable and too under pressure on other reasons, because of the Save Ulster from Sodomy campaign in the 70s. But we did work hard on those murders, and we especially were concerned about the judiciary and the way they dealt with people who were, and in some cases, charged and convicted, because what was known as the Portsmouth defence was always on offer from the lawyers involved, and the Portsmouth defence, as the name suggests, was to do with sailors, and essentially it was a classic defence why somebody had robbed a gay man or murdered them, because essentially the defence claim was that they had been provoked because the individual had made a pass at them in some way, and they therefore had to stab him 40 times or whatever it was. And that Portsmouth defence is still being run in, I think now in England and maybe here, it's now impermissible to run that as a defence. And it was certainly run in the Declan Flynn case in Dublin, because I think the murderers were convicted and weren't even jailed. So the judiciary had to be educated, and has been educated, I think, in some respects, that that we're not second level individuals. That but it's been a hard and long slog. I mean, the other aspect, particularly with lesbian women, was the access or custody of children, and we had several cases that, in particular, Stella Mann, who's now dead, but she fought the case for custody against her former husband and lost. And this was a woman who therefore didn't see her own daughter for some 15 years. The one good thing about it is I went to the civil partnership of Stella and Eileen 7 or 8, 9 years ago, and Stella's daughter was I don't know which role she took on, bridesmaid or chief celebrant or something, and it was a lovely moment to see mother and daughter reunited. But that was a 10-year struggle to get custody, to get lesbians to get custody, because it was a very rare event. Judges would immediately say this is morally improper. This mother has forfeited her role as a mother, and therefore the father gets custody. So that was one of the campaigns.
And Jeff, you're the person who brought courts and law into it. So I just one of the things that I'm fascinated by is the actual impact of your case. So I'd like to know what you think about setting that precedent. On a number of occasions, I've shared the little snip of the Supreme Court of the United States decision in Lawrence in Texas, where basically it made it illegal for states to criminalize homosexuality at a state level. And I have this lovely vision of Ruth Bader Ginsburg reading your decision. And I think that's pretty special by anybody's view.
Well, I think, yeah, the Texas sodomy case was unusual in the it's very rare for American judges or lawyers to quote international precedents. They're averse to doing that, but in that case, my case was quoted, and it actually influenced one of the swing judges on the Supreme Court. I think the name was Kennedy. He's since died, but he was a conservative, but he went with the liberal group on the court to judge that, using my precedent, or our precedent, I should say, because remember, we were a team when we went to Strasbourg, and Richard Kennedy, I don't see tonight, but he actually was our driver on going to Strasbourg and looked after us during those 2 or 3 days. So yes, Strasbourg was hugely important, but it continues to be important because it was the first gay case that was won at that court. Up to then, all the gay cases had failed, and there were some from Germany in particular, and the German government would always quote sociological evidence, and whenever we went to look at that evidence, and we discovered it was some of it was dated back to the Kaiser, to Imperial German times, and more worryingly, some of it was distinctly Nazi in its origins and 1930s sociological view on homosexuals. And as you'll know, under the Hitler regime, gay men and lesbians were arrested, and they weren't just jailed, they were sent to concentration camps. No, they weren't sent to the extermination camps, they were sent to the work camps, but they were literally worked to death. And a gay would have maybe had 30 days life in them once they were hit this particular quarry or whatever it was. They had to work 18 hours a day. So we tried to argue the case in Strasbourg, though failed, that these sociological evidences from Germany were inappropriate and just plainly wrong. And but we didn't win that aspect of the case, but that was for another day, because there was then a whole series of cases came along after me. David Norris obviously being one of them, Cyprus another, and then cases were won on adoption and equal treatment before the law and employment discrimination and so on. So we've had a range of victories at the Strasbourg court, and then later in Parliament and in the Dáil, things like civil partnership and equal marriage came along, each built on the other. And I think we've reached a certain high point now. But a lot of countries inherited British law, Commonwealth countries and others, and they've retained that law, especially in Africa. And as you know, there's complications, religious aspects to some African countries. And actually, one of the guys who was talking with me on a Zoom last week, Jerry Lynch, Reverend Jerry Lynch, is making great efforts to get the Church of the Anglicans in Ghana, to try and repeal a new anti-gay law that's just being put through Parliament there.
Thank you, Jeff. In terms of what is left in this country for LGBT rights, what do you think is the next hurdle for LGBT people? If there is one.
Well, it's hard to know in some respects, because I don't know the difficulties that younger people face. Well, first of all, they face them younger than I would have. I mean, I detect that people in the age of 10, 11, 12 would be fully aware of their sexuality, or certainly of the issues around different sexualities. And so that, in some senses, it's harder to be aware of those things younger because you're not as experienced as someone older. So that is one issue. Obviously, fundamentalist religion remains, I think, quite important, and has serious effects on people's upbringing. I've noticed that gay pride meetings some time ago now, but the issue when religion came up, it was very much evangelical families, people from evangelical families that were giving witness as to the difficulties they faced. The violence against gay people, I think, is something that will be with us for a very long time. It may have reduced quite considerably. But then there's and the trans issue is so contested nowadays. And, it's moved from being a good cause to a difficult cause. And you all know, and you read about it, it's sort of almost like world war out there on the trans issue. And then alongside that, you've got the gender fluid question, and the categories lesbian, gay, they may be actually dying out or losing impact because increasingly young people don't distinguish themselves in those categories. It's always possible that lesbian gays won't exist in 50 years. There will be some complexities that are not so clear.
Robert, could you mute yourself, please?
Not as my top person. There's no mention of obviously no, you can say someone else.
Okay, so just to end on a slightly lighter note, I've asked people to put their questions in the chat box, so we can have a little bit of a discussion. But a little bit of Desert Island Discs. Are there any songs that really capture the 1970s for you, your case for you, nights out in the 80s? Is there any one song that really, really brings back memories?
On the Zoom at the moment. Yes, it's sorry, I was otherwise engaged there for a moment. Can you hear me, Jude?
Yeah, you're so in demand.
The discos, as I said, the disco era remains predominant in the minds of anybody over 50, I would think, if not 60. And the songs of Sister Sledge and Sylvester and ABBA. I don't know if others can particularly recall some of them.
Glad to be gay.
Glad to be gay.
Yeah.
Well, of course, Tom Robinson, 2468 Motorway and his later one, and Mark Allman, Soft Cell and all that. But Tom Robinson, who is actually features on that Peter Tatchell program, which is you can see on Netflix at the moment. It's a very inspiring and interesting program. I just finished it last night. And Tom Robinson of the Tom Robinson Band features, and he had a concert, fundraising concert in London for our appeal for Strasbourg, and he raised, I think, around about £1,000, which was something like 20% of the total, and enabled us to take that case, which we didn't get all the money back from Strasbourg. We got 2/3 of the costs, which were on around, I think the costs were around £5,000. Nowadays it would probably be £500,000, but that shows the level of inflation since the 1970s. I'm seeing these questions coming up now. What advice would you impart on the next generation of young activists? This is from Julianne Core Johnson. Don't know if people want my advice particularly. It's always better to be reasonable, I think. But then again, without, and this came up very much in the Tatchell film last night, Tatchell wasn't always reasonable, and he pissed a lot of people off within the gay community and the gay organizations. And yet he achieved, I mean, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Lord Carey, was on the program, who I think loathed the sight of Peter Tatchell. But by the end of the program, he was saying things, well, he was a bit like Jesus, which I thought was taking it too far, perhaps. But it shows the impact of a single radical outlier can be in that respect. I see Nigel Wiltshire's asked what was considered the swing vote, I suppose, in the European Court. And would it have been possible for another court? Well, we went to Strasbourg because we'd exhausted our domestic revenues, which is the basic rule. You can't go there until you have so exhausted. Now, the vote was, I think, 14-5 in my favor. And so there were only 3/4 of the judges, of the 20-odd judges, voted for a change, to find out criminalization, total criminalization, to be a breach. And the ones who were against us, as I recall, were Ireland, Turkey, and I think Portugal. No, I may be wrong about those. So it was a dramatically good vote. I sort of think that Strasbourg waits until there's a consensus of countries, maybe at least half countries believe in a certain change or law thing, which is why, as I pointed out the other night, they still have not found a case favoring gay marriage, and they've gone as far as saying civil partnership should be available, but they have not gone that step further, because I suppose half the countries in Europe are still haven't changed their laws in that respect. And on abortion, they certainly haven't found abortion to be a human right. They've found aspects of access to abortion a right, but not abortion itself. And there's been cases in Dublin, in Ireland about that as well. Somebody asked how have I found lockdown. Because, that's Nigel again. Well, if you don't go out very much, you hardly notice it. And you can, so I mean, I've been out. Some people haven't been out at all, as far as I understand that, but I have been out a good number of times recently, but at meetings, but all slightly distanced. But if you've got
Jeff, I have to ask a couple of questions from the LGBT History Project volunteers, or else there will be mutiny. Elspeth Fisher, who's one of our history volunteers and a cinematographer, do you have a favorite film that addresses any LGBT issues or has inspired you?
That's a good question to come cold. It certainly wasn't Brokeback Mountain, which I thought was a straight love story with gay characters. There were, it's hard to say. I'd have to give me another 5 minutes on that one.
Okay, well, while we think about that, Brian Lacey has asked Jeff, wonder was there any day in McGee or Derry when you were there? And I'll just plug Foyle Pride documentary. There are some people who took part in that on the Zoom this evening, but it's really excellent about the 70s and 80s. So the Maiden City, call it whatever you like. Was there anything gay happening up there?
No, it was absolutely nothing. And then this was in the era 64, 66. No, things were hotting up in the town politically with the University for Derry campaign, but gays were utterly invisible. There may have, I mean, actually, well, having said that, the two or three of the most prominent people in Gay Lib Society at Queen's, Andy Hines and Dick Sinclair, and I think Martin McQuigg, was he from Derry, Brian? He was, yeah. So there was something brewing or brooding even in the city around and about that time. No question of it.
And Mary Ellen has asked, what about Rock Hudson?
All right. My relationship with Rock Hudson, let's say it was extremely brief. He was in the bar, Bartley Dunn's one night. He was making a film in Dublin. I think it was set, or they used Trinity College as the backdrop. So it was either full of Nazi swastika flags hanging down from a rebuilding, or First World War images. I can't remember which. So he suddenly appeared in the Bartley Duns, and there was a fair number of individuals stood around him and tried to stop anyone else getting near him. But we all had the briefest of chats before he was whisked off by whoever it was and got hold of the star of the evening. So, but at least I knew 30 years before anyone else that Rock was gay.
And I'm so glad that we have you blushing on a video that will be going into the Linen Hall Library and available on their YouTube channel.
Didn't think the colour was good enough.
Just on Rock Hudson, last night, one of those videos came up promoted on YouTube, and it was a video of really from the sort of early to mid 80s, maybe late 80s, a hugely shoulder padded Liz Taylor was talking about HIV and AIDS on national American television. What was it like? Lots of people here will probably have seen It's a Sin last year. What was it like whenever the word came through that there was this illness in Northern Ireland?
Well, it was very nasty in the sense of we'd had a few years of liberation, of a cheerful life where things were only looked as if they could only get better. And then this landed in, and it was the first year or two certainly was, utter fear and panic, not just about getting it, but how to deal with people, address the issue for people who were falling ill. And we were very lucky in one respect in Belfast because there weren't that many proportionate number of people who were becoming HIV positive. But the first days was gross, and the media was running things. People who were ill were actually just being hounded and literally from pillar to post if the media got to hear of it. So it was really, really bad. But Belfast did respond, and I'm not the person best able to talk about it. I know some others were heavily involved in the AIDS helpline and such like. But I mean, I suppose I know about 10 people who died of AIDS here and beyond. So it was that significant. Can you hear me?
Thank you for that, Jeff. Abbreviate a little bit. When do you think attitudes really changed in Northern Ireland towards supporting the LGBT rights cause? And actually, do you think they have? I'm sort of thinking of at the weekend, my boyfriend held my hand and a driver driving past kept staring so much so that he crashed into the pavement. So I'm not sure how much things have actually changed.
Well, I think the big thing that happens, others can discuss it, but if people know people are gay, that changes everything. And until we started to come out, and it only happened in literally in the early 70s, most people didn't know anyone was gay. They maybe had all sorts of attitudes. Half of them might have said, well, I don't really care about it too much, but the other half would find it horrifying or dreadful, or would respond violently in certain circumstances, and crashing cars and all that sort of thing. I mean, I in my time, I've walked hand in hand through the streets of Belfast with drink taken, and I've survived. But you'd never not be cautious, and even now, I'm sure I would be particularly cautious. So when was the turning point? I think it was Stonewall was a catalyst. The advent of gay liberation, the people being seen, heard, and coming out. Coming out was the great achievement that changed everything.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Time is marching on, and it's been really lovely chatting. Does anybody have any final questions that they'd like to ask? And brief questions. I'm looking at you, Lynn. Tom Hume from Queens. Do you think that Save Ulster from Sodomy radicalized the Northern Irish population into homophobia, or was it an expression of homophobia that already existed?
Well, it was certainly very popular. 70,000 people signed the petition of the Reverend Ian Paisley's, which is the figure, actually, coincidentally, was the 70,000 was the figure we were using at the time to indicate the number of gay people in Northern Ireland. I presume that was 5% or something. It was a religious point of view, but it certainly enabled the non-religious, let's say, to be violent, and that was always the great danger. I don't think it accentuated homophobia, because we were out and strong, and we were being heard and seen, and I think that change didn't. I think that we got through because of that. If we'd never been seen or heard, yes, it would have been very bad, but things had moved forward in that respect. And we laughed and sneered at the religious zealots, and even I was on TV with Paisley after the decriminalisation in 1982, and we, to some extent, I'd taken the view that his was a religious issue, and I wasn't going to argue that because I wasn't particularly interested in that aspect of it. But when it became political, going through the House of Commons that year, which Paisley being an MP, I did reluctantly have to go on TV and with Peter Robinson separately to deal with it. And I think, again, it's a small story anecdote, but when I was getting my makeup done in the makeup room, the girl who was applying the material to my gob said, "I've done Peter Robinson's makeup as badly as I possibly could." So there was always secret support out there for us, and that's been true. I think, the gay comics, they may be irritating and they may be stereotypical, but they actually diffuse things a lot for people. And if you can get a laugh out of someone, you can make an escape, if you're lucky. And that's why, actually, just another small anecdote, the poet John Hewitt wrote a poem about our meeting, which he attended, called "As You Like It." And he described all the people there, like myself and Brian Gilmore, who was described, I think, as dapper, and Richard Kennedy, who was tubby and cheerful. And then he said, two girls came in with clipping heels and sat quietly or didn't, sat noisily in the back. And then it was only later he discovered these weren't girls at all. They were young camp boys in effect. So that was the essence of his poem. And I think it was an early example of gender confusion in Ulster.
Oh, fantastic. Hannah has another question. When you talked about Gay Star news, Gay Star, and different LGBT publications in Northern Ireland, do you know how widespread they were and what their readership was like?
Good question. Brian used to do the duplicating on a very hot duplicator. Could probably tell you how many copies we ran off.
I guess a maximum of 20 or 30, you know, but we handed them out at discos, so we were promoting ourselves, you know, so if people came from the centre of Belfast, they would receive copies of our material. But I'll say most people weren't interested in the content of, you know, Gay Star or Negro News. They weren't really. It's a bit impractical, you know.
The content was pretty good, actually, when you look over it again, and very original. Our first record reviewer was a guy called John Little, who went on to become a famous journalist in London. He did Disco Titbits or some such. And Gay Star was actually printed semi-professionally. I mean, the Niagara News was done on a duplicator. I'd say we did more than 30, Brian. I'd say we had 100, and we sold them as well. We tried to retrieve our costs, but I think they're pretty. It's amazing when you look back. Something that you think was very ephemeral, as Tom Hume might be able to tell you, is very important when it comes to historical research.
Talking of historical research that verges on ephemeral, do you know, was there any LGBT activism in Enniskillen?
There were gay people from Enniskillen, but I'm not aware of any organizational or individual efforts. Stephen Burkett would be closer into that because he's from Tyrone.
Yeah, I don't think there was anything in Enniskillen. The only thing I can think of was there was Gareth will know more about this. We did try and have meetings in Omagh, and there was a place in, was it Caledon, Gareth, where people used to go?
Clogher. In the village of Clogher, yes, there was like a walking group, a border area gays as well, operated out of the border counties. But yeah, there was a meeting in Omagh, and then there was a bar in Clogher, which lasted for a good few years.
And Brian would remember, was there activity in Monaghan? Certainly were individuals.
Yeah, there was
yes.
There was
there were
never
actually been so.
Brian's frozen. You froze there, Brian.
Sorry. The were gay meeting places in Monaghan and also Armagh, you know, and also Portadown, but it would be roughly every third Thursday of the month or whatever.
So the LGBT people were everywhere, even in Monaghan and Enniskillen. Jeff, it wouldn't be an event without you taking us through some of the books that you've written about your heroes. So if you can sort of tell the group just about your bibliography and where they can also buy them.
That's a very kind question. I don't know, Colin Flynn seems to be shouting there something. He's muting anyway. Just on the films, actually, well, just the only thing that's crossed my mind on films, going back to an earlier question, as I started watching last night, a Polish gay film called Operation Hyacinth, which is set like in the 1980s on Netflix. And though somewhat complicated and hard to follow, it looks pretty good in that respect. And the question you asked, Jude, then was on my books. Yeah, well, two in particular. I wrote a book on Montgomery Hyde. He was the MP for North Belfast in the 1950s. Now, it's not a very, it's only 60 pages or 80 pages or something, but he was the MP that majored in the House of Commons on homosexual law reform. And that was before anyone else did it. There was maybe 2 MPs or 3 MPs who were asking for change in that respect, as happened after the trial of Lord Montague and Peter Wildblood. So he was a bit of a hero, though I never made any attempt to get to see him, even though he lived on till the 1980s. But he was an interesting character. He's very much a 1920s character, post-war, roaring 20s. His major interests, even though he married 3 times, were Oscar Wilde and Roger Casement. He wrote some 60, 70 books, so he was never stopped researching and writing. But most were, not most, but a significant number were on sex and spying, which shows that you can come out of Belfast and be quite upmarket or advanced, if you want to say that. And the other thing is Roger Casement. As you know, I have published all my stuff is available on Amazon if you're interested. 700-page book on Roger Casement, which because he's the most significant character in many ways of the revolutionaries of 1916, and later, that he also combined this personal aspect of his private life, where he was about as out a gay as you could possibly be. Certainly, I don't think anyone was more busy than he, certainly until the 1970s. He kept, well, you all know the story. He kept certain diaries, which are very sparse, terse remarks, actually more erotic than 10 pages of 40 Shades of Grey or something like that, because they are so tiny in terms of words. But he, just for anyone who doesn't know, he was a British diplomat in Africa and the Congo, and later in Brazil and in Peru, and he was commissioned to write reports on human rights abuses in the Congo and under King Leopold of Belgium, and in Peru, where the Indians, the Amazonian Indians, were being brutalized and used as slaves to bring in rubber. And you know, Peru was worse than the Congo. And he then went political after that. He tried to do campaigns to advance the interests of those particular groups. So he has everything. You couldn't, I mean, the problem with Roger Casement is that if you made a film about him, it would have to be about 50 episodes long, because there are so many different aspects. And the whole issue of the Black Diaries remains contentious, and you'd have to read them for yourself to know. Because if he didn't write them, the British government must have employed hundreds of gay men who could write good novels and turn their ideas, turn their own experiences into his diaries. So I'll keep you going.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you very much to Brian Gilmore, who has posted the text of As You Like It into the chat. Just one last question. I'm sorry if I've missed anybody out in the chat. What do you consider to be your greatest achievement? And then you can tell me about your favorite song.
Right. Greatest achievement. Well, you know, there's personal achievements and then there's political achievements, you could say. And the Strasbourg case is an achievement whose significance is greater than we ever expected. And in that respect, in that context, you know, I'm pleased to be able to say I did it and we won. But the other achievement was just getting Belfast Gay Society up and running and moving along and advancing and increasing in numbers and leaving people who were able to live fulfilled lives in many cases where previously they wouldn't. I mean, when Cara Friends started in the mid-70s, we started on a letter system and we got a flood of letters. And very often they told long letters that told of a sad story of somebody who hadn't been able to ever connect with other gay people. And then when we ran the first day of our phone service, the phone line collapsed from the deluge of calls coming in. So we had to develop our own. Well, we were borrowing a phone. We had to try to get hold of it. In those days, you had to wait a year to get hold of a phone line, so it wasn't easy. But we managed it. And the films, you know, you've got me there, Jude. I still can't think of. I told you about that Polish film.
And what song?
Well, it's not a gay film actually. It's Garden of the Finzi Continis, which is set in Italy during the war. For some reason, it may have been gay. It's so long since I saw it. It was the most visually memorable film that springs to mind at the moment. But others will tell you what films they liked or influenced them. Richard O'Leary, can you hear me? Or have you fallen asleep?
I'm just enthralled to everything you're saying, Jeff. I always learn something new when you speak.
Any good films? Anyone could recommend a good film?
I think The Servant by Dirk Bogarde is well worth watching because it captures the situation of a married man who's being blackmailed. And it's a very fine movie and it's also very insightful. And
yeah, because there were a lot of films in the 70s, 60s and 70s that were edging around the subject. But, you know, it was very hard to make. Well, Bloody Sunday was another film with Peter Finch, I think, which was quite important in those days. But, you know, as Brian will remember, any little fragment of gay presence on the media was exciting and an amazing advance. You know, a 10-line letter in the Sunday News, we would pore over it for weeks, saying how wonderful it was.
Oh, that's amazing, Jeff. A few of the people have said about Torch Song trilogy, The Handmaiden, Disclosure on Netflix, which is about trans rights, Barbara McDowell, The Normal Heart, and that is some lovely viewing. And your homework for the next history project is to go away and watch some of those. So thank you so much, Jeff. It's just been a real privilege and a real honor to have a chat with you. There's always something that you just slip in that you haven't covered previously. I think you're never going to end up running out of anecdotes and things that you don't think are interesting, but that we definitely do. So on that note, the LGBT History Project is always on the lookout for your materials. So everybody in this group has little bits of LGBT history lurking under your bed, in your closet, anything like that. I mean, I'm wearing a bit of history. One of my decrim t-shirts from Friday, which a number of us wore to Belfast City Hall whenever it was lit up, remembering your wonderful victory. So I'm just going to pop over to Mary Ellen, and thank you again, Jeff. And Mary Ellen is going to just close off this evening.
Well, that was fascinating, Jeff. Anytime I hear you speak, I always, like Richard, I always learn something new. And thanks, Jude. That was wonderful. Next month we have our very own Karen McShane, and the title of our talk will be "The Making of Me." So we're going to be looking at a bit of trans history, and hopefully finishing off with what we can do to support our trans brothers and sisters these days, because let's face it, it's really, really needed, that bit of support. So please fill in the surveys. It gives us an idea of what else we can do, that would be interesting to yourselves. And if you have any ideas that you'd like to see in our history club, drop us an email. And like Jude, I again will ask if you have any. Jeff, I'm looking at your background there going, is that paper I see out in that back? Wonder what that document is. And Richard O'Leary, the same to yourself. Anything that we can borrow, and we will borrow it and return it to you so that we can copy it for our online archive, would be much appreciated. Also, just another wee thing we're doing at the moment is we're starting our oral history. So if anybody feels that they have any sort of story that they'd like to share, please, again, come and get in touch with us. You know, if you want to keep your name out, that's grand. If you want to keep your picture off the wall, that's grand. But see, your stories, they're still as valuable as everyone else's. So please, please, please get in touch. On that note, once again, thank you, and thank you to the Lennon Hall Library, and hopefully see you next month.